Good afternoon, everyone, dear colleagues. My name is Ilan Ramirez, and I will briefly talk about and describe the research that I did for my master's degree at the University of Melbourne in Australia. The title of this research is Using Translanguaging Strategies to Expand Multilingual Students' Meaning-Making Repertoires. Now, as you can see, I highlighted those words and phrases because I will be unpacking each of these words in the subsequent slides. All right, now I want to give you a little bit of context so that you could better understand why this research is so relevant. In many educational systems, especially the ones that receive a lot of immigrants from different parts of the world, like for example Australia, these students come to these schools, let's say these Australian schools, and they already have or speak one, two, or even three languages. Now, where's the problem? These students are instructed at these schools with monolingual approaches, which doesn't allow them to use their full linguistic repertoire. Meaning that these students are instructed, let's say, in under English only policies, which limit their capacity to acquire knowledge and, of course, language. And as a result, there is an urgent need to implement language pedagogies or strategies that use and that take into account the rich linguistic repertoire that these students already have. And here's where the concept of translanguaging comes into play. So here's where the concept of translanguaging gains relevance, because it offers the pedagogical strategies that could help the learners with the issues that I just mentioned, because it follows the notion of building on bilingual students' language practices in order to develop new understanding and new language practices, including those that are deemed academic standard practices. So it builds the strategies, the pedagogical strategies based on the practices, on the language practices of the multilingual speakers. And in that way, translanguaging legitimizes and values the linguistic repertoire of students. Now, what do I mean by linguistic repertoire? So imagine, for example, this is my mind, okay, my head, and I speak English and Spanish. According to the traditional model of bilingualism, I have English and Spanish as two separate compartmentalized things in my head. According to code switching, I go, for example, from Spanish to English depending on the situation where I am, right? However, translanguaging is a little bit different because it mixes both languages into just one linguistic system or one linguistic repertoire, in where I, as a speaker, choose the linguistic feature of each of these languages strategically, depending on the situation where I am. So, if schools and educational institutions in general follow the concept and the notion of translanguaging, there's not going to be that discrimination of languages, because we will see students as having one linguistic repertoire, and within that linguistic repertoire, this student speak or possess different languages. So in this way, we're going to use all of those linguistic resources that students already have to help them acquire new content and the additional language. Now, there is already a growing body of literature that looks at the implementation of translanguaging pedagogical strategies in classrooms and educational settings in general. However, there is still a gap in the regarding the explicit taxonomic use of translanguaging strategies, which makes it really difficult for teachers to implement translanguaging in the classroom. So we have the translanguaging strategies already in the literature. There's actually a book that was made here, as you can see, about translanguaging, where there are many translanguaging strategies that are ready to be used in the classroom. However, they are not categorized or structured in ways that show which ones are the ones that tap into the different cognitive levels of learners. If we are to implement translanguaging in the classroom, as teachers, we need a clear understanding of the learning and meaning-making benefits of the different translanguaging strategies. So, by drawing on current translanguaging strategies found in the literature, this study tries to fill this gap in the research by providing a taxonomic categorization of translanguaging strategies that are relevant for the expansion of a student's meaning-making resources. So, in order to develop this taxonomy of translanguaging strategies, this research attempts to answer the following question. Now, what do I mean by meaning-making repertoire? And the meaning-making repertoire refers to the resources or tools that multilingual students have in order to access content knowledge in the classroom. So it's whatever resource, whether it's a linguistic or a non-linguistic resource, that we use to acquire new content. So I will look at which are the translanguaging strategies that actually expand these meaning-making repertoires of students. So I will briefly talk about the methodology that I use to answer my research question. So the critical theory and transformative pedagogy from Cummings were the main theoretical framework that I use for this research. Because translanguaging as a pedagogy is not only about allowing students to freely use their linguistic resources to learn, but it's also about disrupting the hegemonic discourses towards minoritized language students. So these were my two theoretical frameworks that I used. These were the steps that I followed to analyze the data. I used a systematic review of the literature of 15 peer-reviewed papers. I analyzed their findings. I used these exclusion criteria that you can see here, and then I put all of those, all the primary data from those 15 peer-review papers. I grouped them into what I call a literature review matrix that you could see in my paper later, and from that I developed two themes. And two themes were analyzed based on Bloom's taxonomy, because Bloom's taxonomy is used to categorize thinking skills into it classifies thinking in 6 different levels of cognitive complexity. Since the aim of this research is to investigate the types of translanguaging strategies that expand the meaning-making repertoire of the students, I found Bloom's taxonomy to be very relevant to distinguish and classify the different translanguaging strategies that expand the meaning-making repertoires of students. So after labeling these strategies, they were analyzed into two themes. These themes are the more cognitive demanding translanguaging strategies and the less cognitive demanding translanguaging strategies. And as you see here, these are all the strategies that I found in the 15 peer review papers. And based on those strategies, I developed this translanguaging strategies continuum, this taxonomy of translanguaging strategies based on which ones are the ones that are more cognitive demanding and the ones that are less cognitive demanding in relation to Bloom's taxonomy. So we can see here, for example, in the more cognitive demanding one, mother tongue based discussion groups. where students are being grouped according to their home languages, something that is usually not advisable in educational settings, like in Australia, for example, where they actually separate students who have the same home language. In the less cognitive demanding side, we have, for example, translation, which for a long time has been regarded as a very negative strategy in the learning of an additional language. But according to the studies that I've analyzed, it has actually proven to be a very effective strategy, especially with beginner students, with students who don't have still a command of the additional language. And also, it was used to explain grammar concepts and vocabulary, for example. So, some of the theoretical implications and contributions of my research. It has been shown that using students' full linguistic repertoires has positive outcomes. Allowing students to use all of their linguistic resources to make meaning has many positive outcomes for the learning of new content from the part of the student. We have found, based on the taxonomy of translanguaging strategies, which are the ones that challenge students more cognitively. And a very important implication and finding was also that most of the translanguaging strategies are found in the lower side of the continuum, meaning that translanguaging as a pedagogy is not being used to its full potential. So we need to develop more translanguaging strategies that are in the higher order cognitive side of the continuum. And also my contribution to the field of bilingual education, especially in the context like Australia, for example, where they receive a lot of students with different backgrounds, with different languages. This taxonomic set of translanguaging strategies will be very useful for these educators who want or desire to implement translanguaging in the classroom. So thank you so much, and I'll be here to answer your questions.